little while ago, I read a foreign affairs article on weaponized interdependence, the weaponized world economy. Together with the recent shifts in the global economy caused by Trump's abuse of asymmetric interdependence to impose harsh tariffing and protectionist laws, which was discussed in another foreign affairs article, of which I don't have the copy anymore because I gave it to my friend, the Rob Keohane one, I've begun to question the extent to which globalization actually makes the world more free. Thomas Friedman's theory of a flat world posits that globalization works in three stages. A historical one, whereby trade is dominated by states. If we take constructivist game theory as a sort of sociological snapshot here, states are still hyper-realist because they're in the early days of interaction. Economic power is largely imperial. Empires dominate global trade because they dominate global trade fleets. So interdependence exists primarily as military alliances, shaky trade agreements, and trade within empires, such as Britain's East India Company. Early interdependence, if you will. Next is the growth of MNCs, and the dominance globally as the world begins to expand outward. Freer trade, travel, and need for greater information flow following the Industrial Revolution means that industrial companies and individual companies grow to expand worldwide. With game theory as a snapshot here, states are still extremely realist, but interdependence is on the rise as trade grows and they begin to rely on one another for resources as the global supply chain is properly established. Imperialism is still dominant because states can get resources without needing to be tapped into a global supply chain. However, the world is shifting towards being truly globalized, and as a result, more liberal, particularly as empires wane following the World Wars. This is about 1800 to 2000, according to Friedman. Finally, we've got the modern day. 2000s onward, globalization 3.0, according to Friedman. Individuals are empowered by individual access to information and free travel. Here, the constant interaction from state to state and increasing economic interdependence means that game theory is theoretically quite positive, a world of mutual benefit and relative gain rather than zero-sum absolute gain. Global competition means protectionism and turtling up within an empire is unviable. If wages are cheaper somewhere else, you send your workers there and you offshore there, bringing economic prosperity to that nation and therefore flattening the world as it becomes richer, decentralizing power from the individual major states that used to comprise the globalization 1.0. There are many criticisms to be made of this theory. As a Marxist, for example, I might argue that global trade, such as the textile industry, is entirely reliant on an unflattened world. Post-colonial debt traps, MNC exploitation, all of them rely on things like local laws or government involvement to keep people poor. And to me, that's the only way that an international capitalist market works. Take Bangladesh, for example. Even after attempted wage reform, a race-to-the-bottom model created by a very unregulated value chain, particularly as individual private entities work within Bangladesh themselves to compete for contracts from larger MNCs based in Western global north companies, means that wages in Bangladesh have remained below the poverty line for people in the textile industry, and that real wages have only increased by 0.95% when accounting for inflation. This, compared with the growth of companies with those workers in Bangladesh, like H&M or Zara or whatever, shows how the world does not simply flatten as the result of offshoring, but instead moves exploitation elsewhere. Kwame Nkrumah described this as a global shift of the proletariat. In his mind, Africa was onboarding what the West lost when it became wealthy, as the population of wealthy states became wealthier. The proletariat was moved internationally to states already rife with poverty, so that they could employ industrial cheap work there. So you see the issue with this theory, right? It's effectively trickle-down economics globalized, but with this like theory twist to it to make it sound like it's anything but voodoo economics for the dialectically inclined. I would actually argue that Friedman's theory is like an example of political and economic pseudoscience in that sense. It takes no risk of assuming the future, but instead kind of seeks to construct a narrative by cherry-picking the past and coming up with this idea where globalization is moving towards some ideal neoliberal society. At a broader level, though, it makes another, arguably more ridiculous assumption, which is the so-called decline of states. His globalization 2.0 implies that MNCs become dominant over states, and that, globalization 3.0, it's individuals empowered by MNCs and everything like that. And that just ignores the imperial era, running side by side with that 2.0. By painting the market as this neutral progression from state to individual freedom, he ignores the role that states have in constructing the technologies that supposedly free individuals, and how they abuse and exploit those technologies to maintain power over the global economy. Imperialism in 2.0 dominated the development of information, centralizing power in the global north, with the British Empire, for example. The development of new technologies came at the expense of resource-rich poorer nations, such as with the telegraph. The Earth was not flattened by this. Britain still controlled the flow of information, and this information behind that technology creates imbalances in information that have effectively created the asymmetrical global economy of today. That was pretty wordy, so basically what it means is that having control over designs, knowledge, that sort of thing, is in and of itself enough to empower a nation to stay economically in control of others. This can be seen with US dominance over computer technology post-war as we start moving towards 3.0. Telecommunications were not a privately created endeavor, but instead began with projects like ARPANET, through which the US levied their superior resource access to ensure power over a future global telecommunications network where they were always developmentally ahead of other nations, smaller ones which tried to compete. Okay, and that brings us to where we are today. Rob Keohane and Joseph Nye advocate smart power, that is, the use of hard economic power to create trade-like relationships with smaller states, thus improving democratic power and allowing influence through a combination of the two avenues, as an equitable means of expanding global US influence. To that token, the liberal world order is, according to Friedman, a means of greater liberalization in broader power terms, as smaller states are able to compete and thus flatten not just the balance of economic power, but of power as a whole globally. Trump's tariffs and the general US usage of economic sanctions to achieve foreign goals, which may have otherwise been reserved for military power, reflect a shift in the perception that asymmetric interdependence is positive. In his Foreign Affairs article, The Long American Century, which is the one that I gave to a friend, Keohane criticizes Trump's abuse of asymmetric interdependence as unwise, as it reduces the legitimacy of America as a leader of the free world, instead painting it as this self-interested real estate, sort of an unreliable basket to put all your eggs in. So to do a little constructivist sort of game theory break, the recent interactions from state to state, such as the EU with the USA, have shown the US to be prone to defecting, leading the EU to shift away from US trade and begin establishing relationships with more reliable partners like China. This seems to support a global capitalist market-based view of the world. If you abuse those markets and interdependence is uncompetitive, that will lead to both hard and soft power loss as your legitimacy is eroded and your markets are less frequented. This is where an argument of asymmetric interdependence becomes relevant, however. A state such as the EU has a relatively low import-export ratio of around 1.6 to 1 with the US, and has several viable trading partners to move away from the US if it becomes more aggressive with that tariffing. As a part of the global north, it has access to the technologies of the global north, a privilege not afforded to all nations. Abe Newman and Henry Farrell's article, it makes reference to a key interaction between China and the USA. Trump attempted to stop China from accessing key Dutch lithographs needed to manufacture semiconductors in an attempt to reduce their sort of constantly growing expansion into the semiconductor market. Semiconductors are really important right now. If you don't know why, that's on you. Look it up. They're important for military technology, for AI, for all of the big economic drivers right now. Now, Trump has increasingly tried to become more independent in terms of producing semiconductors because he doesn't want to be reliant on a global market for the reasons that we're about to see from China. China is a great power state themselves, and they leverage their own resources, which were rare earth metal access in this case. Lithium is really important for batteries and that sort of thing, to respond in kind and effectively force the USA to back down. That same privilege is not afforded to smaller, less developed nations. US sanctions on Iran did not merely restrict their trade with a giant like the USA, but instead isolated them completely by sanctioning international banking communications cooperative SWIFT to pressure them into removing Iran from their platform. If you are not independent, then your reliance on other nations for economic, resource, material goods can be exploited by another power. And that's why Trump wants to become independent on something like semiconductors. He doesn't want to be reliant on China for the development of technology, particularly as semiconductors are increasingly under threat. That's why they've moved so much away from Taiwan, which used to be the semiconductor manufacturer. Still kind of is. Trump's tariffs show a leveraging of those asymmetric relationships with the USA has created a sort of power imbalance across the world. They use their information and their resources, and smaller states that have operated in like a trade surplus, would the USA are forced to accept harsh tariffs and go crazy riding Trump to themselves not be plunged into a financial crisis. The US economic strategy of trade deficits and information access with smaller states can in some ways be seen as a positive, as mentioned before. After all, it helped China emerge into a power able to reject the US's leveraging of that asymmetric relationship as they began to exploit and develop their own technologies. But to paint capitalism and globalization as altruistic endeavors is to utterly miss the extent to which they are reliant on good actors. Trump's isolationism indicates a US move away from a mixed smart power approach and towards a purely hard power, isolationist, realist approach, which is by no means to say that presidents before Trump were good or even fair. Trump just sort of has less restraint in terms of using these tools. Constructivist theory may argue that good actors, or at least ones that follow the rules, are to be expected. Much like Wendt's discussion of sovereignty, whereby it's rare for one state to invade another, because if you impede on another state's sovereignty, that in turn delegitimizes sovereignty as a whole and reduces your own sovereignty. A state cannot reasonably violate international markets just because. International markets rely on states treating them well, treating them fairly, and participating. It may create economic shock for smaller nations, but if a nation or a state like if a state like the US tries to leverage its markets, become isolationist, and participate in zero-sum games as a power grab, the game theory box will simply tilt to a worst-case realist scenario. Black box everything. Economic and technological power should only be effective as the systems that enable them. But this misses the US's absolute dominance over the geopolitical landscape. As a left-wing British citizen, I've obviously been keeping a close eye on Zach Polanski. One of the things he advocates for is a NATO without the USA, because Washington has shown itself to be an extremely self-interested actor willing to leverage its relationships with other nations for its own individual benefit. The Trump administration then is merely sort of a reminder of what the US could do if you ran afoul of it, even during a more liberal administration, and what they very well have done with nations like Iran. I would argue, though, this separation is not just unwise, but also extremely unlikely. A NATO without the US would militarily be far weaker, to state the obvious, but also impossible, given that the US would pull out literally every stop: diplomatic pressure, further tariffing, attempted economic isolation, to keep the relationship alive. Put simply, Europe does not have the resources to do it on its own. The only way to separate from the US is to, by yourself, become individualist. And I think an isolated EU, aside from the fact Britain isn't even a part of the EU, wank, is very, very, very unlikely. The result of this is that broadly, states must concur with the US ideologically, which is why we've seen so many European state leaders try to appease Trump. Take Blair's bizarre support of the US invasion of Afghanistan, despite its extreme unpopularity in the UK back in 2000. This is a long-running issue. And they also have to adopt US ideas economically, taking on strange sanctions, battling for tariffs to be removed instead of just sort of going with them and letting the US suffer. Anarchy is what states make of it. But when one state can establish a hegemony, it becomes so powerful that a state has no ability to ignore it. Asymmetric interdependence, it's sort of like an actual relationship, in that one state can sort of manipulate another by giving them positive material benefit, positive feedback, only to create a relationship that state cannot leave and then go on to abuse and exploit the other state. It's a contrived metaphor, sorry. The flat world theory is a limited one. In my mind, it's the result of an extremely hopeful liberal perspective, one which sees capitalism and global markets as liberators rather than another tool of states to exert their global influence through inequalities. At a deeper level, though, past its assumptions of this neoliberal success, I believe it fundamentally misses the role that states play in the world of global politics, and thereby reveals a deeper systemic issue of global capitalist markets, which is that states can dominate not just other states, but individuals, the people within them, and great power conflict is life. The Cold War never ended. Oui, oui.